Hello, my dear students. Welcome to the session number 5 of the Model Developmental Psychology 2. Today, in our class, we'll continue to talk about psychosocial development of adolescents. And we have three very interesting topics. First, we'll talk about emotions and emotional development, then about peer group and friendship relationships in adolescence, and finally, uh, about sexuality. Yes, because sexuality, we talked about it, about puberty as a physical or biological dimension. Today we'll talk about sexuality as one aspect of psychosocial development. Why we are talking about emotions and emotional development? As I told you at the beginning, the emotional regulation is one important dimension of adolescence because of the prefrontal cortex, this one that we have here and we already talked, because the prefrontal cortex is in a process of maturation. This area of emotional development is particularly important in adolescence. So that's why I would like just to make a brief review about this area. And the first idea that I would like you to have is that indeed the emotions are, first of all, a biological, a physiological reaction to any external stimulus. Indeed, what happens, and it was William James, the first person to highlight that, what happens is that when we have something that is a threat for us, initially we have a physical reaction. Just after this physical reaction, an emotion is perceived and the human being will take an action based on that emotion. So indeed, we'll talk about emotions, but we need always to think that an emotional is stored in our brain and in our body. And when we talk about emotions, uh, it's also important to distinguish emotions from feelings. Emotion is something more primary, and the feeling is the process of living an emotion, is to be conscious of the emotion that we are having. So the emotion comes before, and the feeling is the process of being aware and experiencing that emotion. And we can distinguish the emotions in two main levels. A level 1 with 5 basic emotions, and then a level 2 with many different secondary emotions. These 5 basic emotions are exactly this from the film Inside Out. We have we have uh, joy or happiness, we have anger, we have fear, we have sadness, and we have disgust. All these 5 emotions indeed have functions in terms of human being survival. And that's why we have these emotions. All of them serves to protect us and to keep us alive. Um, So if you see this film that I strongly recommend, you will have the opportunity to have a very, very good summary about the 5 basic emotions and the process of emotional functioning in our brain. Besides the emotions that we feel, we can also talk about background feelings. When we talk about background feelings, it's like this landscape emotional mood that some people has, and this can also be considered as our temperament. This temperament that we have will affect and will be with us and will affect our behavior and will be part of our daily life and including in our personality and identity. But what I'd like today here with you is the concept of emotional competence. Indeed, in adolescence, it's really, really important that the adolescents will be emotional competent to know how to deal with their emotions. And when we talk about emotional competence, we have 3 main dimensions: emotional knowledge, emotional regulation, and emotional expression. When you will be psychologists or counselors and you will work with adolescents, indeed, one important role that you will have in your work is to promote emotional competence with your clients. And here I want to make a brief summary of what is this for you in the future to be more aware if you need to prepare these kind of things. So emotional knowledge is the ability to detect and label different emotional cues in himself or in others. Is to look at myself and to really be able to label what I'm feeling in each moment. Or also to look at the others and to be able to understand what is the emotion that that person is feeling. And indeed, to have a good repertoire of emotions, a good list of emotions that I know, different names, it will be really, really important. For instance, if I will ask you what is the difference between shame and embarrassment, how would you explain this? In the class on Monday, we'll talk a little bit about that. What is the difference between shame and embarrassment? But indeed, to know how to identify these emotions is really, really important. And in adolescence, it is a predictor of social competence and peer acceptance. The students are showing that those students, those adolescents who have better emotional knowledge, that are more willing to identify the emotions in themselves and in others, they have better social interactions with the others, they have better academic achievement and less behavioral problems. I will give you one example. Imagine that I don't know many emotions. I just know feeling good or feeling bad. If something happens that makes me feel uncomfortable, immediately I will label it as feeling bad. For instance, I saw someone laughing when I said something. If for me, I don't know many words, I can label what I'm feeling as angry. But I don't need to feel angry if I know all the words, if I know to say I'm feeling disappointed, I'm feeling embarrassed, or I'm feeling uh, ashamed. But if I don't know other emotions, I will label this as anger. And if I will feel anger, if I interpret my emotion, if I label it as anger, I will attack and I will have behavioral problems. That's why, indeed, to promote emotional knowledge is really, really important uh, from early ages, but particularly in adolescence. Another important dimension of emotional competence is emotional regulation. Emotional regulation is the ability to adjust the emotion to a specific situation, or not to be dominated by the emotion. Imagine, for instance, that you will see your grade and you have a very good grade and you are really happy for that. But at the same time, you can see that your friend close to you had a very low grade. So in order to have a good emotional regulation, it's not expected that you start shouting of happiness and making a big party because you know that your colleague is disappointed and eventually sad because of that. So it's essential that we have this skill to regulate our emotions according to the situation that we are living. And this is also something that can be trained and practiced with the student. Finally, another aspect of emotional competence is emotional expression. The ability to express what we are feeling is really important and is clearly a competence. Indeed, uh, the psychiatric hospitals have much more men than women, exactly because men are not that willing to express their emotions than as women are. So it is also important to give adolescents opportunities to express their emotions and to talk with people, to talk with friends, to talk with adults in which they trust, the coach in the football, a nice teacher. but also arts, music, painting, dance. This is really, really important. And also writing. Writing is always an important and powerful strategy for adolescents to express their emotions. I would like to suggest you to do one exercise for emotional knowledge. This simple exercise of making picture cards for different emotions and then to do some drama to try to make the others guess what is the emotion that you have is really powerful. So if we will be having a class on the campus, we will be doing this exercise. So I will invite you to do this with your friends, to make picture cards about emotions and then to make dramas to try to make the other guess what is the emotion you have. This is a very interesting exercise that in the future you can do with your clients to promote emotional knowledge. So, emotional competence is a very important dimension of psychosocial development in adolescence. Another important dimension is peer group and friendship relationships. Indeed, it happens that in adolescence, adolescents start to spend much more time with friends and less time with families. Indeed, the influence of the friends starts to be higher than the influence of the parents and other relatives. Uh, and this is so much important that it helps also to create and generate possibilities. With the influence of peers, adolescents will start to see that it's possible to be different. Oh, in my family, we were used to do things in such a way. But in the family of my friend, they used to do like that. And other friend, they have different beliefs. So indeed, the influence of friends in adolescence starts to be really important. And this is always a dimension that we should pay attention when we are working with adolescents. And when we talk about peer groups, the friends, we can define three types of groups that adolescents have. The first type is what we call the dyads. The dyads is related to a peer relationship with someone that is real close. The best friend or a sibling or a cousin. This is more common in girls. This thing of having a best friend forever, a BFF, of someone that is really close to me. And this is very typical in adolescents, as I told you, mostly in girls. The other important group that adolescents have are what we call the cliques. A clique is one small group that is what we can call my small group of friends. This group can be more formal, that is related to those friends that we have related to a specific organization, to a specific context. For instance, my colleagues from the sport team or my friends from my music class. These groups are formal and usually have specific moments to meet and usually are supervised by adults. But we also have what we call the informal clique. This informal clique, this is my small circle of friends. Those colleagues or friends form other formal groups that we keep with us, and then that when we are in holidays or when we have a weekend, we call them and we meet to hang out and to be together or to go out. These informal cliques are really, really important for adolescence, and it's where we start to create more intimate and close relationships. Besides that, it's also typical in adolescence the development, the participation or belong to crowds. Crowds are traditionally groups uh, associated to a specific label to identify people with specific characteristics, usually related to specific location, a socioeconomic status, specific abilities, specific interests. For instance, you can have the group of people, the rockabilly, the group of people who adolescents who like this specific type of music, or the K-pops, the adolescents who like to listen K-pop. Or we have the skaters, those group of people who like to skate, or any other groups. Usually these groups are related to a specific way of dressing, a specific way of talking or speaking. If you see the trailer of this film, Teen Beach Movie, you can see a very interesting example on how you can see the bikers and the surfers as two crowds very typical in the United States. This is another aspect that we can discuss a little bit on Monday. If you think that it's possible to identify crowds in Macau. In these groups, in these informal cliques, or even in the crowds, it's very typical that the adolescents will create their romantic experiences. And indeed, romantic relationships are very important for adolescents' social worlds. That's why now we'll talk a little bit about dating, romantic relationships, and sexuality in adolescence. Indeed, as we can see in this picture, there is a moment in life in which suddenly adolescents start to have interest for sexuality and start to have this specific drive for everything related to sexuality. And that might happen to some kids, like this one that we can see here, and not to the others. But it happens, the interest and the drive for sexuality. And this is indeed a very challenging period for adolescents. Everything related to sex appears suddenly in this time. And this means that, as we already talked on puberty, our physical appearance change. We start to have matured sexual penis, boobies in the girls, and we change our body and we start to feel sexual desire. Indeed, this libido or drive for sexuality appears, and this creates a new challenge. How can I deal? What I will do with this sexual energy that I have here with me? And because of that, we also need to deal with attitudes and values of the society. As you all know, to talk about sex is still a taboo in many countries, in many places. And the adolescents have to deal with this thing of, I feel this sexual desire, but I have to deal with all these values, moral values and attitudes that I have. But it's important indeed for me as an adolescent to start to experience sexual behaviors and to know and to understand more about my body. There are different motives for sexual behavior reported by adolescents. The first one is desire. Indeed, the libido or sexual drive is the first reason that adolescents will find for sexual behavior. But there is also curiosity. The idea, the idea of um, the idea that I want to explore, to know more about my body and to know more about the physical sensations of my body and how to share these sensations with others. This is also one of the reasons for sexual behavior in adolescence. But also for some adolescents, achievement of social status. It's true that both for boys and girls, for some of them, to have sexual behavior is a kind of way of feeling important, to show off to the friends and to the colleagues that I already did that, I already did this, I have lots of experience with girls or with boys, is a way of feeling important in the group. To establish independence from the parents, or to make a sign of rejection of parental beliefs, is also one of the reasons that some adolescents have. A way of showing myself that I'm more independent, I'm growing up, and I'm going against your own ideas. So for some adolescents, this is a way of showing power and that I'm a grown up and I do whatever I want with my body. And of course, as you can imagine, this is not the best reason for sexual behavior. But indeed, besides that, for many of the adolescents, sexuality is also related to emotional feelings. Indeed, in many cases, sexuality is related to romantic relationships, to a perception of love, care, intimacy with someone, and as something natural that appears with someone for which we have real feelings. There are also cases in which sexuality appears for emotional regulation as a coping mechanism to deal with negative emotions, with sadness, frustration with some things, conflict with parents, and sexuality might appear as a strategy to deal with negative emotions, which, as you can imagine, is also not the best motive for sexual behavior. There are different types of sexual behaviors, and I would like to make a brief review of the main sexual behaviors that exist in adolescence. Fantasy, masturbation, making out, sexual intercourse, and same-sex behavior. Let's talk a little bit about this. Fantasy is the most common sexual behavior in adolescence. I put here these different gentlemen because indeed I had to deal with all of them with three women of my life. This guy is named Patrick Swayze, and the bedroom of my wife when we were young and dating, her bedroom was filled with posters of Patrick Swayze. My eldest daughter, she was completely in love for this guy, Zac Efron. And now my youngest daughter, she's completely in Harry Styles and this guy that I don't remember the name. And all of them, they have posters about themselves. Indeed, to have fantasies and to think about models uh, and for which we have a huge attraction and we start to have fantasies as a way of rehearsing and thinking, imagining sexual encounters is very common in adolescents. Another very common uh, sexual behavior is masturbation. Indeed, this is something that usually adolescents do in a private way, in privacy, and but should be considered as a normal activity. This is a way for adolescents to release some of this energy related to sexuality, but also a way of exploring their own body, a way of being aware of their own physical sensations. And indeed, most of the adolescents, they report they already have different types of masturbation, but it is also still associated with some ways, forms of guilt or shame to talk about this. Another important and very significant sexual behavior is making out. This physical and intimate contact with a partner when we are dating with someone or when we go to a party and we meet someone and we start to have pleasure in touching in different ways with others. Of course, that when we a huge percentage of adolescents in a study that I found from 14 and 17 years old, they reported that they already kissed, 86%, 47% that they rubbed their body against other, and 16% that they engage in genital contact. Indeed, uh, this making out, as we will see later, is a form of sexual behavior that can be very positive and a very good experience for adolescents. The other sexual behavior is sexual intercourse. And usually there is a typical sequence for sexual intercourse. From holding hands to sexual intercourse, there is a typical evolution of behaviors. Of course, that holding hands and then kissing the neck is the starting point. And usually with time and the more the adolescents, the couple, will start engaged and involved with each other, this is the typical evolution of the sexual behavior until intercourse. But indeed, making out itself, as I was saying, has a positive impact on adolescent and adult sexual behavior, pleasure, and satisfaction. Indeed, those adolescents who have positive experiences of making out during their adolescent years will report to have a better sexual experiences when they will become adults. So it's positive to accept and to give opportunities for these close relationships between adolescents. But I will want to know what you think about this. Finally, sexual intercourse. This is one of the possible sexual behaviors, and here I have, according to the data from the World Health Organization, I have the median age of sexual intercourse. Around the world is around 18 years old. In China, according to data from 2011, the first sexual intercourse is at 22 years old. In Portugal, 17, and United States, 18. So this data is a bit outdated. Maybe I need to find more updated information, but I would like to discuss with you about this to know what you think about that. Indeed, usually when the adolescents or young adults have their first intercourse, usually is with an heterosexual experience. In adolescence, it's really interesting to know that most of the times the sexual intercourse is not something that is planned. Usually, the one boy or one girl, they don't plan, in a specific day, in a specific moment, I will have sex. Usually what happens is that they found themselves in situations that will be appropriate, or they will create what we call hot cognitions that will bring them to a sexual experience. Usually is, for instance, a party in which everybody is together, or a gathering in which everybody is together in a living room, playing games and drinking a little bit of alcohol, and suddenly they start to create situations, context and environment that leads them for sexuality. Indeed, planned sex is not very common in adolescents. Usually is the desire associated to a specific situation that brings the opportunity for sex to appear. Another interesting aspect of sexual behavior that I would like to discuss a little bit is about same-sex behavior. And about this, I only would like to highlight two main ideas. First, that not all adolescents who experience same-sex desire or even some behavior, they will become gay or lesbian. Indeed, same-sex behavior can be considered as another way of generating possibilities, of experiencing how it is, related to curiosity and to the need of feel and experiencing things. So it's not because one adolescent has some desire, fantasy, or even a small experience of homosexuality that they necessarily will become homosexuals. Indeed, there are studies showing that around 8% of boys and 6% of girls reported to have some kind of same-sex attraction when they were adolescents, but only 2% of them, they report that they are indeed lesbian, gay, or bisexual. It's also interesting to notice that the age of the first same-sex activity for girls usually is around 14 years old, and for boys is around 13 to 15 years old. Finally, the sexual behavior is related to one phenomenon that is the pregnancy in adolescence. Indeed, when you will be counselors, this might be one of the reasons for you to have clients, the fact of having girls who will be pregnant during this age. And indeed, we have here data showing that this is something that seems not to be important in Macau, seems. So in Macau, the official data is showing that there are not many cases of pregnancy in adolescents. But this around the world, indeed, we have many cases, and this red line is the world. And in Portugal, we also have some cases. However, I think that we should discuss this a little bit about your perception about this reality, because we have this idea that the data from Macau and China in general might not be that reliable. So let's talk a little bit about that. In the pregnancy in adolescence, as you can imagine, is related to not using condoms. So to prevent responsible sexual behavior, it will be essential to prevent pregnancy in adolescents. But indeed, the studies are showing that the majority of teen pregnancies end in birth. Indeed, most of the girls who got pregnant in adolescence, they have their kids, and the percentage of abortion around the world is only around 26%. So because of pregnancy in adolescence, and also because of other risk behaviors that might be associated with sexuality in adolescence, one of the things that most of the times is asked for the counselors or psychologists working with adolescents is to do education for affections and sexuality. And when we are doing this, first of all, it's important to take into account the role of the family. We cannot neglect or forget that each family has their own ideas, their own values, and we need to respect it. So when we talk and we give education about affections and sexuality for adolescents, we should always take into account their family values and the importance that family should have on this. But we should also think about what to expect from the school. The school should not do anything. Uh, this is not something that should be discussed there, or the school should have a specific discipline for these kind of things. The social worker or the counselor should run workshops or classes about this, or on the other hand, this is something that should be discussed across the various disciplines for different in history, in biology, in psychology, in other disciplines to talk about sexuality in a very natural way. That doesn't matter that much. What is important is that we should talk about that. And one idea is exactly that when we talk about sexuality, we should always talk together with affections. Just the idea that we put together affections and sexuality is a way to show adolescents that these two things should come together. And finally, the main idea of all training and education in sexuality is that intercourse is not the end point of sexual arousal. The idea when we are with someone is to teach and to discuss with adolescents that this is not like a race for intercourse. That is not an end point. There are ways of having pleasure and being together that should be explored, not having this as a target that the adolescents would have for their sexuality. So the idea of thinking about sexuality as a way of showing affection and to experience different sensations with someone is really important for adolescents. Finally, what influences adolescent sexuality. As we already told, one of the aspects is puberty. I told you that mainly in girls, early menarche is something that makes them be more at risk to start sexuality earlier and to have more risk factors. But there are also genetic factors. Studies are showing that the sexual behavior of girls is related to the behavior of sisters or even the mothers. So it seems that there is some genetic factor here. Also, the influence of the peers to observe the behavior of our friends is also affecting the behavior that I will have. Then we have the culture and religion. Different religions and cultures defines specific standards or expected sexual behaviors, and also parental influence, the communication and the supervision. Indeed, over-controlling parents are not good, the same way that neglected parents are not good. It's expected to keep the adolescents under supervision, but also to show trust and to keep an open communication with the adolescents in order to be able to talk about these topics and to promote appropriate sexual behaviors. Finally, the media also affects and influences sexual behavior of. Finally, when we talk about the association or relationship between sexuality and education, there are two important, interesting data to show. First, to show that adolescents with higher educational aspirations or with better academic performance, they tend to postpone the first intercourse and to have sex less often. This means that when the adolescents are more focused in academic activities, they tend to leave sexuality as a second for a second plan, and especially in girls, time spent in academic activities has a negative relation with activities related to early intercourse. So I want you to keep in mind that as psychologists or counselors working with adolescents, sexuality will always be a topic for our intervention and to work in an open way with our students. And on Monday, in our class, I hope to talk about this topic a little bit with you. Have a nice day and see you on Monday.